Hi, I want to make what is I hope to be a brief video, and it's a video about how everything has an effect on everything. Obviously, we're in a world full of interactions, and we're in a world where we're a sentient thing trying to find comfort, and that's exactly the thing that we're in. We're a function based on a function that created us, a deterministic function. Our very process is a deterministic function. Everything that's happening in us has a function, a practical function to make us exist in this existence. And this practical function is based on the existence to make us able to live in this existence, because the existence that we're trying to live in is the thing creating these functions, and these functions are allowing us to live in it. So it's like a symbiotic relationship. We were based on an equilibrium or a compensation in the world that didn't need to exist to begin with, per se, because we didn't need to have a sentience, but we're based on the same mechanism that's allowing us to live in this mechanism. So a mechanism that existed and built us so that we can live in the mechanism, because we were made from the mechanism, allows us to live in this mechanism. But the sentience is where the mechanism starts losing control, because where these precious awareness, this precious sentience is being controlled by these crude forces, and that's exactly what we're the thing that we're fighting. The forces we're fighting, the forces we can't fight, only we could try to mitigate against. We can fight them because we can be aware of these things. We could be aware of our discomfort. That's exactly what the description. But we can only be so aware, and we can only do so much about these specific circumstances. We can only change life so much, because we can't change the fundamental aspects of life. Life's a zero-sum game, and that's the aspect in recognizing that we can't change, and that problem in recognizing the zero-sum game and how everything has an effect on everything is the very thing that we can't change, and it's the thing that we're being controlled by. And we can only change life to an extent so much before we recognize it. An end can be met, and we can only change it to a certain end so much, and we can only do so much in changing the existence and the way that reality exists, and that's essentially the breakdown of how we can exist. And going back to this subject and how everything can have an effect on everything. Everything that we do has an effect on everything. Your wishes, your hopes, everything. Everything's an interaction that has an effect on some other interaction. So even something as medial as me wishing, me keeping something in my head has an interaction, because all these interactions are forced in the same barrier, the same bubble that we're existing in, and that's exactly what it is. I can have a hope and a dream. It exists in the same barrier, boundary that everything else exists in this reality. It has an interaction. It causes another interaction. A thought in my head, a notion in my head, causes some kind of something outside causes a subconscious notion in my head, allowing me to consciously think about it and circulate it in my processes, and then I can do something based on the interaction. Everything has an interaction. Everything, practically from our point of view, has an interaction, and that's exactly, we're bumping into different interactions, bumping into different circumstances, and all sorts of things like that create us. And we're constantly being controlled by these mechanisms, and there's nothing we can do, and we really can only do so much about these mechanisms that are controlling us, and that's exactly the point. And the point is making another distinction between language and wishing and thinking, and how wishing and thinking is just applying certain things to languages based on concepts and ideas that we have. And it's the distinction between having something made out of a language and making that distinction, and having a thought process, and that's another distinction to make, is how we describe these wishes and hopes and these very impractical, superficial things that we think that have no effect on something. We think because it's in our head it has no effect on something, but it does have an effect on something, even though it is in our head. It's a notion in our mind, but it still has an effect on how we think and how interactions, the butterfly effect, how everything affects everything, regardless of how medial it is. Even if it's just a notion in our head, the notion has an effect on us, because the notion is made on a process that's made out of us, causing the process to cause another process based on the interactions, because we're all in the same bubble, we're all in the same barrier, we're all in this existence moving and bumping into each other, and that's exactly what we're doing, where we all have an effect on everything. Everything has an effect on everything, regardless of what's going on. And things like that. So regardless of that, that's exactly the mechanism that's at hand, right? That's the function of reality, is just all these interactions moving in the interaction of our sentience, an interaction that created our sentience, and that's where we are now, and that interaction is creating more interactions, making us victims of these interactions, and we're just playing the game along with those interactions. And the interactions can be as medial as a notion in our head, and it can be as medial as just looking over at something just for a spare moment, and then looking back, and then you can think it doesn't mean anything, but it has a meaning regardless. It had some kind of effect, and the effect that led from that, because the very foundation of our future moving forward is based on the things that happened in the past. So everything that happens in the past, every interaction that's happened, has some kind of meaning, regardless, because it's built off of some previous experience, and that's what makes it mean something. So every little thing has an effect. So yeah, and making the distinction between things like language and applying that to the circumstances and describing things like hopes and wishes and describing things. Words have an effect. Describing things has an effect, regardless of that effect having anything to do with describing the right way of describing the world, because obviously the interaction that's existing is existing. It's a notion. It's a comparison. It's a connection that we have with understanding the world around us when we describe. We use words and trying to find words to describe the correct circumstances as best as we can. And that's all we can do, is try our best as we can to find a way of describing certain situations as best as we can, that we can make everyone understand as close as and more as accurately as we can. And it doesn't matter that we're not necessarily describing it as accurately, is exactly one-to-one, but the very description of our existence and the things that are happening is one-to-one, because we're in the existence to begin with, because the logic that we claim to spew from our mouths as being existent in and of itself based on our viewing. Even if you're hallucinating, it's something that exists regardless, and it doesn't need our notions of describing it to exist, and it exists regardless of our language and making that interaction itself. But that interaction in and of itself exists. All those interactions in and of themselves exist, and regardless of our understanding, it doesn't need our understanding for it to exist. And I think that's pretty much it. So every little thing has an effect on something else, regardless of any of that other stuff. So yes, we have an effect. Every little notion, every little thing has an effect. But to a certain degree, we can only have certain expectations and understanding the extent of those effects, and we can understand, generally speaking, how far a certain thing can go based on these little minute things that we think are minute. But sometimes they can be big, but we can only make so many implications in understanding how every little integral piece of, integral little thing is going to move and interact with each other. Every little variable is going to interact with each other. We can only know so much, and that's exactly what we can do. We can only have it beyond a reasonable expectation and understanding how everything around us is going to move, or how everything else is going to have an interact and move on into the future, and move and create something else, making the present moment a thing of the past, and so on and so forth. So I think that's all I need to say. So thank you. Bye.